Hi guys! So this week was week 3 of Module 4, and we talked a lot about commons culture and creativity. So we started out discussing ways to see the past. So typically when we talk about history, we give important dates that marked some sort of power struggle. So dates, the first day of World War One or the last day of World War Two, or big dates that are often influenced and associated with some sort of violence, like September 11th of 2001, things that aren't exactly what has created our culture, but things that have happened within our culture. So we started out the week talking about ways of seeing the past. So we can either choose to look at our culture through the lens of violence and destruction and like a power struggle, like a political battle, or we can look at culture through innovation and creativity, the things that have actually, created the computer I'm using to record this on right now, that have created, the podcast app that I listen to all of these lectures on. We can look at things and see something totally different if we change what we're looking at. So then we talked about like the basis of different cultures. So you can have a patronage where artists are being supported directly from the community, it's like a person-to-person kind of relationship. Artists can also be supported by the market. So that's what you will see now here in America. They put their put their art out on the market, and people will buy it or not, and they're either being supported or not. Or one thing that has been popular through the years has been institutional support, which could also be known as government support. So institutional support puts a lot of liabilities, a lot of restrictions, a lot of you have to go through me to get to them kind of action happening. So most markets function, or most artists and most art functions best in a market environment because it allows there's some competitiveness there that allows artists to produce greater works because obviously they want people to buy whatever they've created instead of whatever somebody else has created. So there's some competitive drive. It also allows them to have direct contact with their audience. So if someone didn't buy something, they're going to be able to talk through that and see how they can improve, what they can do better, how they can, sell them on their next product. So we talked about Shakespeare theater, how it was kind of formed, how it thrived. Shakespeare became a brand. He was one of the first playwrights that was advertised as like, this is Shakespeare's play, you want to see it. And previous to that, no one had associated it. Was just like, they want to see this play. They didn't know who wrote it. They didn't care who wrote it. Shakespeare came along and kind of changed that. He became a brand, and it was a Shakespeare play. You didn't care who was in it. You cared who wrote it at that point. So it was really interesting to think about that, because he brought up the way that we talk about movies. Like, we don't know the director of movies. We don't care who directed the movie. We want to know who's in the movie. So is it a Sandra Bullock movie? Like, who's playing? Are there Hemsworth brothers in it? Like, we want to know those things. We don't care who wrote it or who directed it. We want to know who's in it. So the fact that Shakespeare was someone that they could brand to say, hey, Shakespeare wrote this, it was an entirely new level on the theater. And then we talked about patronage versus the market. So cities are created for commerce, and if you value that kind of environment, commerce, everyone has to pay a price. You can't have, everyone has to give something to get something. No one gets anything for free. So when you have artists willing to create and give their art away, they are going to have to kind of get whatever the market is willing to give them for that. And the market is going to have to say, like, okay, you're not helping us in, the city, you're not helping us by defending city or growing food or something. So we're going to maybe give you food for your art. And there's some sort of trade-off that happens there. So one thing that was super interesting that we talked about this week is the fact that cities have to reach a certain economic status before art can flourish. So if you have an extremely poor city, they're not going to be able to afford to go to the theater or to buy a book or to buy paint and paint. So it's not until cities reach a certain economic status that you can really begin to see art thrive, because they don't have the economic wealth to throw it around a little bit and have some enjoyment. Then we talked about music, about Mozart and Bach and some other well-known people, but we talked about how you can take different aspects of music. So at first, music was just something that was performed in some sort of arena. So whether that was a theater or just on the street, there was some sort of host. Once they started producing sheet music and artists could sell their sheet music, they kind of began directly engaging with the market. Music was now something that was accessible to a whole new variety of people. Anyone that had enough money to own an instrument could now play Mozart or Bach or Tchaikovsky or anyone that was willing to sell their sheet music. They could now have that access to it. So you get into this whole debate about, is the pure artist, so someone that creates in isolation, creates something that would be their pure artistic vision. It's not going to be influenced or criticized, or it's not going to follow anything that anybody else could potentially put in its way. When you produce for a market, you have some level of influence. So there's someone saying, oh, I don't think that sounds good. So if they want to still sell whatever it is they're creating in music, they're going to change the way it sounds so that people are going to buy it. The big idea was, if you have artists interacting with the market, does that limit the level of their art? Like, what does it do to the creative idea? Is it still a pure creative idea, or is it suddenly ruined? So throughout we talked about novels, we talked about modernism, we talked about politics, we talked about totalitarian culture, I think I said that right. We talked about motion pictures, we talked about pop culture. I mean, one thing that I thought was super interesting, which is totally kind of off topic here while I'm looking at this page of notes, we talked about how novels used to be published in the early 19th century. They would serialize them, so they would publish a chapter, maybe 3 chapters in a newspaper every month or in a magazine. And so by the end of the year, you could read the whole novel, but you would only ever read 3 chapters at a time. So we talked about how when you get writers publishing like that, the novel obviously has to meet certain criteria. It has to be so long, and it can't be as long as you want. If you wanted it to be longer, it has to stay within this kind of framework that fits their magazine and their readers. So when you take art and you try to put it within that framework, what does that do? Does it make it better? Does it make it worse? Does it create more competition? How exactly does that all come together? So then we talked about modernism, and we talked about how art should be patroned, and when we reject a work of art, we are we're rejecting the system. We're rejecting the people that we have poured into, that we have given resources. So when we can look at art and say, I don't understand it, but that's okay, we can bring another level of excellence to the culture that we have. So we talked about art in the 20th century. And this was super interesting because they talked about how art can thrive in any culture. So when we specifically, the examples they used here were Hitler and Stalin. So how art thrives under dictators. And this is kind of why a lot of people want to lean away from institutionalized support of the arts, because the artists then had a lot of institutionalized support from the government. But that doesn't mean what they were producing was good. But who are we to say that what they produced was bad? They talk about how it kind of changed our mindset on art, and it brought about the modernism trend because Hitler and Stalin both really liked realistic art. And at that point in time, if Hitler and Stalin liked something, it had to be bad. Like, no one else wanted to like what Hitler and Stalin liked because they were dictators. I mean, they were quite literally destroying the world we knew. So why would we like what they liked? So when you talk about art with intense institutionalized support, there's got to be some pros and some cons. I mean, yes, these artists were given, Hitler poured so much money into supporting these artists and buying their art and giving them art shows and places to support, like places for people to support them. But at the same time, he gave them this framework that they had to operate in to do that. And if they didn't do that, we all know where they went. So learning that art can thrive no matter the culture was interesting because I think we look at art and creativity and we think there has to be this like perfect environment. We can't have distractions, or we can't have like too much influence, but we need some influence, and that perfect environment, it doesn't exist. So figuring out and kind of processing and tangibly seeing where in history art has thrived in previous cultures was more mind-blowing than I would have ever imagined. One thing that I really liked that they said was that the Nazis, so like Hitler and Stalin, hated modernism. They hated the modern art. But now, as they have, kind of gone about changing Germany and Italy and kind of making new of those countries, they have modern art museums in old Nazi buildings, which I think is really funny just because they were so against it. But now that's the thing. It's kind of a nice joke. So we talked about movies. We talked about how you can't predict what's going to stick or what's going to flop. So the Titanic was produced and was predicted to be the biggest flop in the film industry at that point of development. And the Titanic is now a legendary movie that any one person would say that they have A, seen, and B, probably enjoyed the Titanic because of what it is. You can't predict it. It's not something that we can sit down and look at 20 films and just create the good ones. We have to create the bad ones to find the good ones. Overall, this past week we talked about this pyramid, where you have to kind of stack all the bad films or the bad books or the bad sheet music or the bad theater productions, the bad plays kind of down. And eventually you're going to get, ones that are kind of better, the ones that are super good, or the ones that are like the best, the tip of the iceberg, super great. movies, plays, books, music, whatever form of art you're looking at. But it's not until you create all these bad things, these trial runs, that you can kind of filter through to find the outstanding ones. So we talked about networking. So when is a network not a network? And this was super funny because they were talking about television. So television started out and it had 3 channels. I don't recall what they were. I know ABC was one of them. Maybe CBS and CNN, I think. And they talked about Fox trying to become like the fourth channel. You don't just become the 4th channel because you can buy it. You have to, win people to your audience, to your content. They talked about how Fox would have a meeting every week with everyone in the company and talk about their shows. They would have a weekly review, and if they didn't like the way something was going, they would change it. If they didn't get good reactions from one episode to the next, they would address that change as it happened. They did something in a way that none of the other TV producers and TV channels were willing to do. They refined the process so well that by the time the 1990s, early 2000s came along, the best shows were coming from Fox, HBO, and Showtime. All 3 of those channels were owned and operated by the majority of the same people because of their process of refinement and the way that they took to learning their craft to create something. We talked about pop culture and about how you can't judge a new medium of art by the old standards. So when the theater came along, they didn't really have anything before theater to judge it off of. But, then we had movies. So if you were judging movies by the same quality that you would judge theater, there was going to be some places where it didn't match up because they're not the same medium. You have to develop a new type of criteria to judge a new medium. And they talked about you can't predict a new medium, but we have a good guess that video games are going to be the medium of this next century because of the way that there's energy, there's excitement around them. To create a culture, you have to have energy, you have to have momentum for it. So, like always, it was super interesting to listen to all of these. There was a lot of content. One thing that really, 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 really changed what I thought was the whole idea of the way we discredit art. And I recently read an article that talked about how the easy way out, maybe it was last week I read this article, it talked about the easy way out is to never think, to dismiss an idea and to dismiss a thought. And so when we talk about learning to appreciate art in all of its mediums and its styles, we suddenly have a much more broader spectrum of what art is and how we develop art and what we can use art for and how art is developing around us. But we don't know that until we take time to understand and we seek understanding for the art that's going on around us. And I think that as I've gone through some life and I'm looking at art now in different mediums and different ways, creativity isn't something that looks the same. I mean, nobody's going to create the exact same way. But when we find a way to appreciate unique creations, it opens a lot of new doors. So that was super interesting. It definitely brought up some questions, and it's made me super curious to kind of pursue more art. I have this strange desire to go to an art museum and see how I feel about things differently now, because I want to appreciate them and I want to come to understand them in a way that I haven't before. So I have a desire to do that, which is kind of new. So this content definitely made me more I think this whole module has helped make me a little more aware of the way that I will just kind of brush art off or brush creativity off when I don't feel like dealing with it or processing it or coming to understand it, but that doesn't necessarily make it any easier, and that doesn't help myself to be, involved in culture, and it doesn't help the artist with patronage or market either when you just dismiss something that you don't understand. So I don't know that there were a ton of connections between previous content and this content, except the whole idea of like not dismissing art before you kind of like give it a try, and how do we walk the fence between like constructive criticism and letting the artist just create, and what does it look like to find this pure creative vision, and does that even exist? And so there's like some things that I definitely thought of before that I don't think I was really incorporating into life, thoughts, ideas, patterns that I'm seeing now. So that was super cool. But we'll be back with week 4 coming soon. So until then, bye guys.